Hello dear children, I am Anamika Mishra. Today I shall be taking up English Core Class 11 prescribed book Hornbill, and we shall do the poem Childhood written by Marcus Nathan. In this poem, the poet Marcus Nathan wonders when and where he lost his childhood. In this quest to find the moment he grew up, Marcus highlights the innocence and faith he lost even as he gained rational individuality. Adolescence is usually a confusing time for a child who is unable to immediately come to terms with the physical, hormonal, and psychological changes in his or her personality. He no longer feels like a child, but is not quite ready to call himself an adult either. In the poem The Rainbow, William Wordsworth claims, "Child is the father of man." Marcus seems to be echoing this thought as he underscores how in our childhood innocence lay our ability to appreciate the simpler aspects of life, and thus the child can teach the adult how to appreciate things the latter often take for granted. Now children, I am going to read the paragraphs of the poem and would explain the paragraphs one by one. I'll be also telling you the figures of speech which are used in the poem and the difficult words. When did my childhood go? Was it the day I ceased to be 11? Was it the time I realized that hell and heaven could not be found in geography and therefore could not be? Was that the day? The poet wonders when he lost his childhood. He muses that perhaps it was the day he realized that the concepts of heaven and hell he had been taught of since his youngest years had no standing in the light of the day. Geography textbooks did not give the location of any such place. Education made the poet question his faith and look at the world much more rationally. The poet realizes that he might have lost his childhood when he gained his rational outlook. The figure of speech used here is rationalism. The poet realizes that probably the loss of faith and trust might have been the major steps towards losing his childhood. This was his rational thinking. The second figure of speech used here is antithesis. Antithesis is the figure of speech where two opposite words are used together in a sentence. Here, hell and heaven are used together. Let us move on to the next paragraph. When did my childhood go? Was it the time I realized that adults were not all they seemed to be? They talked of love and preached of love, but did not act so lovingly. Was that the day? The passage means that the poet recalls the time when he realized that the adults around him did not practice what they preached. They told the poet to be loving and caring. However, they themselves were argumentative, violent, and discourteous. Their behavior was a far cry from the love they sermonized about and advocated so reverently to the child. Thus the child lost his faith in the adults around him, whom he had so far trusted without a question. Their latent hypocrisy became evident to the growing child. Perhaps, says Nathan, that broken trust was one of the major steps towards adulthood. Notice that this is perhaps the longest line of the poem. Marcus Nathan is a genius at putting punctuation to use. The length of this line and the difficulty to recite it in one go indicates that this is perhaps the biggest loss the child has suffered. Now let us move to the next passage. When did my childhood go? Was it when I found my mind was really mine, to use whichever way I choose, producing thoughts that were not those of other people, but my own, and mine alone? Was that the day? The lines mean that, as he grew up, the poet realized that his mind was unique, could form its own opinions, and could take its own decisions. He gained a sense of individuality which set him free from the prejudiced opinions of others around him. His own experiences shaped his thoughts now, and he realized that this might have been the time he lost his childhood innocence completely. Let us move on to the next passage. Where did my childhood go? It went to some forgotten place that's hidden in an infant's face. That's all I know. In the final stanza, the poet changes his question. From wondering at what point in time he had lost his childhood, the poet now wonders where it went. The last three lines may be interpreted in two ways. The poet claims that his childhood is nothing more than a long lost memory. He recalls his infancy and believes that his true childhood resides there, in that infant's face, and that innocence cannot resurface in this lifetime. The poet believes that his childhood has become nothing more than a memory for him, but has become the reality of some other infant. Innocence is a cyclical process. Where lost from one person, it travels to another, finding residence there. Thus, till date, adults can easily recall and seem to almost relive their own childhood through an infant in their lives. If we pay attention to the rhyme scheme of the poem, we find that the rhyming scheme of the poem is A, B, B, C, C, D. The figure of speech used continuously throughout the poem is refrain. Refrain of any poem is or are the lines that are repeated at regular intervals throughout the poem. The refrain often carries the central message of the poem. The two lines which do so in this poem are, "When did my childhood go? Was that the day?" The first line, which is a question, identifies the central theme of the poem, that is, the attempt to identify when exactly the poet lost his childhood. The second line begins with a question word, but ends with an exclamation. Hence, it is no more a mere question. Rhetorical in nature, this line brings out the poet's sense of realization. Thank you very much, children.